She fined me for swimming in my own lake. So I rewrote the rules and made her pay the price. Ethan Hayes had always considered the 12-acre lake at the back of his property more than just water. It was family heritage. His grandfather had bought the land piece by piece after the war, clearing brush with his own hands, digging trenches, and eventually damming the creek that created the sparkling body of water. Ethan had grown up fishing off its banks, skipping rocks across its glassy surface, and learning to swim in its cool depths. Every summer, it had been the place where his childhood friends gathered, where his first kiss happened on the dock, and where his grandfather taught him that land wasn't just ownership, it was legacy. So when the HOA had expanded into the area years later, Ethan hadn't paid them much mind. Their neatly trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and endless list of rules seemed to belong to another world, a world of control, pettiness, and paperwork. His land wasn't under their jurisdiction, or so he thought. One humid July evening, with the sun dipping low and the cicadas buzzing from the trees, Ethan stripped off his shirt and dove into the lake. The water wrapped around him like an old friend, cool against his skin. For a moment, he felt weightless, free of the mounting bills, the long hours at work, and the constant tug of responsibility. He floated on his back, staring at the orange sky, and let out a deep sigh of peace. That peace shattered when he heard the sharp sound of heels clacking against the dock. Karen Miller, the HOA president, stood there like a queen surveying her kingdom. Clipboard in hand, perfectly pressed slacks, and lips pursed into a thin line, she looked utterly out of place in the rustic setting. "Mr. Hayes," she called out, her voice clipped, "this is a violation." Ethan blinked water from his eyes. A violation of what? Taking a swim in my own lake. Karen's eyes narrowed. Unauthorized use of the water. You're disturbing the community's peace. As president of the HOA, I am issuing a fine. She scribbled something onto her clipboard with exaggerated precision, tore off the slip, and held it out like a verdict. Ethan waded to the shore, water dripping from his shoulders, and took the paper. His brow furrowed as he read the bold print. $1,000 fine, unauthorized swimming. He laughed at first, a deep, incredulous sound. "You've got to be kidding me. My grandfather built this lake. It's on my deed. You can't fine me for swimming in my own water." But Karen didn't flinch. The HOA has jurisdiction over shared community spaces, and that includes the lake. Rules are rules, Mr. Hayes. Ignorance of them is no excuse. That was the moment Ethan realized she wasn't joking. Karen Miller was dead serious, and she had just declared war. The days following the fine were filled with murmurs and uneasy glances from neighbors. Ethan noticed it everywhere. The way conversations hushed when he walked into the local store, the cautious nods from folks who lived in the subdivision that had sprung up around his grandfather's land. They all knew what had happened, and they all knew what it meant. Karen Miller wasn't just the HOA president. She was a self-proclaimed queen of order. Her rules stretched far beyond what most would call reasonable. She had banned pets from the lake path after one golden retriever splashed mud on her white sneakers. She required homeowners to apply for special fishing permits issued by the HOA itself, even though the fish had been stocked years earlier by Ethan's family. Children, once free to ride their bikes along the gravel trails, had been forbidden from doing so because Karen claimed it disturbed the tranquility. The neighborhood had turned into something resembling a suburban dictatorship, and Karen enforced it all with the sharpness of a hawk and the pettiness of a schoolyard bully. Her clipboard was legendary. Pages upon pages of citations, warnings, and fines, handed out with a smug smile and the promise that she was only protecting property values. One evening, while Ethan was locking up his shed, his neighbor Tom wandered over, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Tom was a retired electrician, wiry and weathered, with the look of a man who'd seen too much nonsense in his life. He glanced around, lowering his voice as if Karen herself might be lurking behind the trees. "You'd better be careful, Ethan," Tom muttered. "She's got out for you now. Once Karen sets her sights, she doesn't let go. Ask the Johnsons. She fined them $200 because their garden gnome wasn't HOA approved." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "A gnome? You've got to be kidding me." Tom's expression didn't change. I wish I was. Folks around here, they just pay the fines. Too scared to push back. HOA can make life hell if they want to. And Karen? She enjoys it. Ethan leaned against the shed door, arms crossed. His jaw tightened as he stared toward the lake, its surface catching the last rays of dusk. She might enjoy it, Tom, but this isn't her lake. It's mine. My grandfather built it. I'm not bowing down to her or anyone else waving a clipboard. Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. That's what I figured you'd say. Just watch your back. She's not used to people saying no, and she won't take kindly to it. Ethan gave a slow nod, the words settling deep in his chest. The neighborhood may have been under Karen's rules, but he wasn't like them. He had history in this land, roots that ran deeper than any HOA bylaw. If Karen wanted a fight, she had picked the wrong man, and as the crickets began to chirp in the gathering night, Ethan made himself a quiet promise. He would not be intimidated. The yellow glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across Ethan's study, a room lined with old books, framed photographs of his grandfather, and maps that told the story of the land as much as any family album could. It was close to midnight, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. His hands smelled faintly of lake water from the evening swim, but his blood still boiled with the absurdity of that fine Karen Miller had slapped on him. $1,000. For daring to swim in water his grandfather had damned with his own sweat. The paper citation still sat on the corner of his desk, its bold print glaring at him like an insult. He picked it up again, turning it over in his hands. Unauthorized use of the water. The words were laughable, but beneath the laughter was something darker, a warning shot. Karen thought she had him cornered. But if there was one thing Ethan had learned from his grandfather, it was this. The law is written down somewhere, and if you know where to look, you can always find it. So, while the crickets sang outside his window and the moonlight rippled across the lake, Ethan opened his laptop and began to dig. The county archives. The county's digital records system was clunky and outdated, the kind of software that looked like it hadn't been touched since the early 2000s. Ethan clicked through page after page, entering the parcel number listed on his deed, then cross-referencing it against zoning maps, annexation documents, and anything else he could find. It was tedious work. Legal jargon piled onto legal jargon, scanned PDFs of faded papers, maps uploaded crooked so that north pointed sideways. But Ethan had patience, and more importantly, he had motive. Every line of text, every footnote, could be a weapon if used correctly. After nearly 2 hours, his eyes burned, but then something caught his attention. An annexation map dated from 15 years. Earlier, when the HOA subdivision had first been created, the map outlined the boundaries of the neighborhood's jurisdiction, showing each lot, the streets, and the designated community areas. Ethan zoomed in. The lake wasn't highlighted. In fact, the map stopped just short of his property line, clearly marking the water as private land. His pulse quickened. He leaned closer, scrolling further through the records. The original deed from his grandfather was there too, scanned in grainy black and white. Ethan's grandfather's signature was written in a strong, deliberate hand. Below it, the wording was crystal clear. Parcel 117B, encompassing the 12-acre lake, adjoining forest, and surrounding acreage, to remain private property in perpetuity, exempt from annexation unless expressly sold or transferred. Private property, exempt, outside jurisdiction. Ethan sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. The words felt like ironclad armor. Karen had overreached. The HOA's grip ended where his shoreline began, no matter how loudly she barked about rules. The smirk of revenge. He closed his laptop for a moment, letting the satisfaction settle in. His grandfather had been a stubborn man, often accused of being old-fashioned, but this was proof of his foresight. He hadn't just left Ethan land. He had left him protection, a fortress written into the very language of the deed. The smirk that tugged at Ethan's lips wasn't just relief. It was the beginning of something darker, sharper. Karen Miller hadn't just picked the wrong man to bully. She had picked the wrong battlefield. He could have marched over to her house right then, deed in hand, and shut her down. But no, that would be too easy. Too quick. And Karen would twist it, spin some story to her board about misunderstandings or technicalities. No, Ethan thought she needed to be exposed. Publicly. Thoroughly. He wanted every smug word, every clipped sentence of hers, to come back and burn her. He wanted her to regret the day she tried to claim his lake. Memories of his grandfather. As he pored over the records again, making careful notes, Ethan's mind drifted back to evenings with his grandfather. The old man had often sat at this same desk, pipe smoke curling lazily in the air, explaining how the land was more than soil and water. People will try to take what you've built, Ethan, his grandfather had said once, voice gravelly with age. Sometimes with charm, sometimes with lies, and sometimes with papers and signatures. But remember this, land is truth. If you know your truth, they can't take it from you. Ethan swallowed hard at the memory. That lesson had seemed abstract when he was a boy, but tonight it rang with crystal clarity. His grandfather had prepared him for this. And now, it was Ethan's turn to defend the truth. Digging deeper. By 3 a.m, Ethan had assembled a thick folder of evidence. Printed maps, copies of deeds, highlighted clauses, all of it arranged with meticulous care. He wasn't just gathering proof for himself. He was preparing ammunition. The more he read, the more he realized Karen had been bluffing for years. She had wielded the HOA bylaws like a sword, but those laws were paper-thin compared to the county and state statutes. The HOA could regulate lawn heights, fence colors, and mailbox designs. But private property, especially one that predated the HOA, was untouchable. He found case law, too. Court rulings from similar disputes where HOAs had tried to extend their reach beyond their borders. Every single time, the verdict had been the same, outside jurisdiction. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples, exhaustion pulling at him, but satisfaction keeping him awake. He had her, dead to rights. The decision. By dawn, when the first streaks of orange light broke across the lake, Ethan stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee in hand. The water shimmered in the morning calm, undisturbed by Karen's rules or her clipboard. It was his. Always had been. Always would be. But Karen didn't know that yet. And Ethan decided, right then and there, he wouldn't simply show her the deed and demand she back off. That would only reset the balance to where it had been. He wanted more. He wanted to turn the tables, to make her feel the humiliation she had dished out to so many others. He thought of the neighbors, the Johnsons with their unauthorized gnome, the kids who could no longer ride their bikes, the fishermen fined for daring to cast a line without Karen's permission. They had all lived in quiet submission, too afraid to challenge her. But Ethan wasn't afraid. He was going to fight back, and not just for himself. For every neighbor Karen had bullied, every petty rule she had enforced, every dollar she had squeezed out of families under the guise of protecting property values. As the sun rose higher, Ethan's smirk returned. He had the law on his side. He had history on his side. And most importantly, he had nothing left to lose. Karen Miller had started a war she couldn't win. And Ethan Hayes was about to show her exactly what it meant to pick a fight with a man who owned the ground and the water beneath her feet. The folding chairs in the HOA clubhouse creaked under the weight of uneasy neighbors. A fluorescent light flickered above, buzzing faintly like a mosquito that refused to die. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. Ethan sat in the back row, his cap pulled low, a notepad resting on his lap. To anyone else, he looked disinterested, maybe even bored. But every tap of his pen, every quiet glance toward the front was calculated. Karen Miller stood at the podium like a politician on the campaign trail. Clipboard in one hand, gavel in the other, she addressed the room with her usual self-importance. As of this month, she said, her voice sharp and commanding, the HOA has voted to increase annual fees by another 10%. This is necessary to cover maintenance costs for the lake path, the security patrol, and landscaping improvements. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew the lake path. He walked it almost daily. Not a single new board had been replaced in years. Weeds grew through the gravel, and the so-called security patrol was nothing more than a golf cart that rolled by twice a week. As for landscaping, The only improvement he had seen was the row of roses Karen had planted in her own front yard, neatly billed under community beautification. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few muttered, but no one raised their voice. That was how it always went. Karen spoke, they grumbled, and then they paid. Fear kept them in line. The threat of fines, citations, even liens placed on their homes if they didn't comply. Ethan scribbled notes onto his pad. Fee increase. No receipts. Maintenance not visible. He underlined the words twice. Building the file. For weeks, Ethan became a shadow at those meetings. He recorded everything, every speech, every gavel strike, every smug declaration Karen made. He slipped his phone into his shirt pocket with a microphone facing forward, capturing hours of audio. When Karen dismissed concerns with veiled threats, perhaps you prefer the HOA to reassess your compliance record? The microphone caught every syllable. He began collecting HOA newsletters, each one announcing new fees or vague expenses. Community security expansion, $12,000, though no new cameras or lights were ever installed. Lakeshore restoration, $8,500. The shoreline remained exactly as it had been, overgrown and untouched. Recreational area upgrade, $15,000, which mysteriously coincided with the brand-new patio furniture on Karen's back deck. Ethan didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, he built a binder, thick and organized with tabs for every category: fees, threats, misused funds, witness testimonies. The deeper he dug, the uglier it became. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She was siphoning money from her neighbors like a parasite, disguising theft as community service. The Whisper Network. It didn't take long for whispers to reach him. One evening, while mowing his yard, Ethan spotted Mrs. Caldwell, a frail widow with thinning white hair, hovering near the fence. She glanced around nervously before approaching. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, I heard you're looking into Karen." Ethan shut off the mower and wiped his brow. "Depends who's asking." Her lips trembled into a faint smile. "Not Karen. You could trust me. She fined me $300 last year because my grandson left his bike in the driveway overnight. Said it lowered the community aesthetic. I can't afford to keep paying her every time she invents a rule." Ethan's chest tightened with anger. Mrs. Caldwell lived on a fixed income, her husband's pension barely enough to cover the bills. $300 to her was no small thing. It was groceries, medication, heating oil in the winter. "You're not the only one," Ethan said quietly. "But I need more than stories. Do you have receipts? Letters? Anything official?" Her hands shook as she reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of notices. Pink slips, payment receipts, warnings, all signed with Karen's immaculate signature. Ethan accepted them carefully, as though they were evidence in a trial. Because in a way they were. That night, he added a new section to his binder: victims. The pattern. The more he gathered, the clearer the pattern became. Karen's fees always followed the same trajectory. She would announce a vague improvement, demand additional funds, then funnel the money into her own property or personal expenses. The lake path restoration was her garden walkway. The recreation fund was her new hot tub. Neighbors too afraid to fight paid quietly, and those who resisted were targeted until they broke. Threats of liens, harassing letters, citations for absurd violations like improper lawn gnome placement or unsanctioned mailbox paint. It wasn't just greed, it was control. Karen thrived on fear. Ethan, however, was immune. He didn't live under the HOA's thumb. His land, his lake, and his home were beyond their reach. That made him dangerous, and he knew Karen would come after him with everything she had. So he decided to set the trap, recording the Queen. The opportunity came one night after a particularly heated meeting. Ethan lingered outside the clubhouse, pretending to check his phone while the crowd dispersed. Karen exited last, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "You're awfully quiet these days, Mr. Hayes," she said, pausing by her car. Her eyes narrowed. "Planning something?" Ethan offered a half-smile. "Just listening." Karen's lips curled into a smirk. "Good. You do well to listen. Some of your neighbors have made mistakes thinking they could challenge the HOA. They paid dearly for it. Homes could be lost, you know? People forget how much power we have. Ethan's phone, still tucked in his pocket, recorded every word. He nodded slowly. I'll keep that in mind. As Karen slid into her car and drove away, Ethan's smile hardened. He didn't just have her greed on record now. He had her threats. The binder justice. Weeks turned into months, and Ethan's binder grew into something formidable. It was no longer just papers. It was a case file strong enough to cripple Karen's empire. Receipts, testimonies, recordings, photographs of her personal improvements purchased with HOA funds. One section he labeled irrefutable evidence, the crown jewels of his collection. Among them, a contractor's invoice for patio furniture, billed to community recreational funds, shipped directly to Karen's home address. A landscaping bill marked Lake Shore Restoration, signed off by Karen, with photographs of her rose garden matching the date. Audio of Karen threatening homeowners with foreclosure if they didn't comply. A video Ethan discreetly captured of Karen's new hot tub installation, paid for in full by HOA general maintenance funds. Every piece was a nail in her coffin. Patience before the strike. Ethan didn't rush. He could have exposed her immediately, but he knew timing mattered. A trap wasn't just about having bait. It was about knowing when the prey was most vulnerable. So he waited. He attended every meeting, kept every receipt, gathered every whispered complaint. He made himself invisible in plain sight, nodding along with Karen's speeches, even pretending to agree with her at times. All the while, his binder thickened and his smile grew sharper. Karen believed she was untouchable. She believed fear made her invincible. But fear could be turned, and Ethan intended to unleash it back on her, piece by piece, until her empire crumbled. By the end of that summer, Ethan stood at the edge of his lake one evening, the binder resting on the dock beside him. The sun sank low, staining the water in shades of fire. He looked out across the rippling surface, the same water Karen had tried to claim, and whispered to himself, "It's almost time." The letter came on a crisp September morning. Karen Miller had a talent for timing her threats. The envelope was slid neatly into Ethan's mailbox, its contents typed in cold, bureaucratic language. The HOA had reassessed his situation and declared his $1,000 fine overdue. Unless payment was received within 30 days, penalties would accrue, legal action would be considered, and the HOA would pursue any means necessary to ensure compliance. Ethan read it once, then again, his lips curving into a slow smile. He had been waiting for this moment, the calm before the storm. That evening, the lake was eerily still, a sheet of silver under the fading light. Ethan sat on the dock with a mug of coffee, his binder resting beside him. Every page had been carefully tabbed, every receipt highlighted, every audio clip transcribed. Months of quiet work had built to this point. It wasn't just a binder anymore. It was a weapon. Karen thought she had delivered an ultimatum. In reality, she had opened the door for Ethan's counterattack. The delivery. The next morning, Ethan walked into the HOA clubhouse. The board sat around their usual table, sipping coffee and flipping through the agenda. Karen, at the head, adjusted her glasses and looked up, startled to see him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Here to pay your overdue fine?" Ethan set the binder on the table with a heavy thud. "No, I'm here to submit evidence." Karen's smile faltered. "Evidence?" Ethan flipped the binder open, sliding pages across the polished wood. Invoices for patio furniture billed to HOA funds, landscaping receipts for her rose garden disguised as lake restoration, photographs of her hot tub, audio transcripts of her threats. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from curiosity to alarm. One man cleared his throat nervously. Another muttered something under his breath. Karen's face drained of color. "This," Ethan said calmly, "is a record of how you've been using HOA money for your own property. I've already sent copies to the county auditor. And by the way, your neighbors have copies too." The scandal ignites. By the time Ethan returned home, the wildfire had already started. Word spread faster than he imagined. Neighbors gathered in driveways, clutching their copies of the binder, whispering and shaking their heads in disbelief. "Did you see this? $15,000 for a hot tub. She billed us for roses." Roses? My God, we've been paying her mortgage. The binder wasn't just evidence. It was a mirror. And for the first time, the community saw Karen clearly, not as the selfless protector of property values she claimed to be, but as a petty tyrant who had fattened her purse on their silence. Phones rang. Emails flew. The scandal was unstoppable. Karen's desperation. That evening, Karen showed up at Ethan's doorstep. She didn't look like the iron-fisted queen of the HOA anymore. Her face was pale. Her hand shook as she clutched her clipboard like a shield. "You've made a mistake," she hissed. "You think this will stick? I'll sue you for defamation." Ethan cut her off, his voice calm and measured. "It's not defamation if it's true." "And Karen?" "Every word, every receipt, every recording, it's all true." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. For the first time, she was speechless. "You wanted to fine me $1,000, Ethan continued. "Instead, I fined you your reputation." He closed the door slowly, leaving her standing on his porch, trembling. The board fractures. 2 nights later, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. This time, the room was packed. Neighbors who had once avoided meetings now filled every seat, their anger simmering. Karen tried to speak, to spin the story, but her words were drowned by the shouts. "You stole from us. We trusted you. My kids can't ride their bikes, but you bought yourself a hot tub." The gavel, once her weapon, clattered uselessly on the table as the board voted unanimously to suspend her presidency, pending investigation. For Karen, it was the beginning of the end. The county steps in. A week later, county auditors arrived at the HOA office. They carried boxes and cameras, combing through files and hard drives. Neighbors watched from their porches as Karen stood by helplessly, her perfect posture crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. Local reporters showed up, notebooks in hand, cameras flashing. Headlines soon followed. HOA president accused of embezzling funds. Residents demand answers after years of misuse. Karen's name, once feared, was now infamous. Ethan's quiet victory. Ethan didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't need to. His victory was in the silence that returned to his lake, in the smiles of neighbors who no longer walked with their heads down, in the laughter of children riding bikes freely again. Sitting on his porch one evening, he opened the binder one last time. The evidence that had once been a secret weapon was now public record. His work was done. He thought of his grandfather again, the man who had built the lake, who had warned him that people would try to take what wasn't theirs. Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had lived up to that legacy. The war wasn't over. Karen still had claws, and no doubt she would fight to save herself. But Ethan had cornered her, and she knew it. And the best part? He hadn't needed to raise his voice or break a single law. He had simply held up the truth, and the truth had destroyed her. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Saturday evening, and word had spread like wildfire across the neighborhood. By 5 o'clock, the clubhouse parking lot was packed with sedans, SUVs, and golf carts, each carrying residents who had grown tired of Karen Miller's iron fist. Some came out of sheer curiosity, some out of pent-up frustration, and others out of the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the day Karen's reign would finally collapse. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere was electric. Folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a long oak table where the HOA board members sat stiffly. The air smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Conversations buzzed in hushed, angry whispers. "She charged me $200 because my flower pots weren't the approved color," one woman muttered. "That woman made me tear down my swing set for the grandkids," another man whispered, shaking his head. "And let's not forget she fined Ethan Hayes for swimming in his own lake," someone added, and that remark drew a ripple of laughter and outrage through the crowd. Karen entered late, clutching her notorious clipboard against her chest like a shield. She wore her usual pastel blazer and pinched smile, but her face was pale, her hands trembling just slightly. She knew the air had shifted. She wasn't walking into adoration and obedience anymore. She was walking into judgment. Ethan sat halfway back in the crowd, his arms folded, his binder of evidence already handed out earlier in the week to board members and several residents. He had no need to speak yet. The truth was already doing the talking for him. The board chair, a weary-looking man named Thomas Green, cleared his throat and opened the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, this emergency session of the Willow Creek HOA has been called to address recent concerns raised regarding financial management and the leadership of our president, Mrs. Karen Miller. Murmurs rippled, some scoffing, others muttering angrily. Karen pressed on, sensing the tide slipping. These so-called allegations against me are baseless. They come from one man, Ethan Hayes, who has a personal vendetta against this board. He doesn't want to follow the same rules as the rest of us. Ethan rose slowly to his feet. His chair scraped the floor, and the entire room quieted. My grandfather bought that lake long before this HOA even existed, he said, his voice calm but firm. I've respected this neighborhood for years, even when Karen fined people for absurd things. But when she came after me, I decided enough was enough. And in the process, I found out she hasn't just been targeting me. She's been bleeding this community dry. He gestured toward the board. Every document I shared is verified. Every receipt, every missing dollar, every maintenance fee that ended up in Karen's personal account. This isn't about one man ignoring rules. This is about an abuse of power. A hush fell. Karen's face flushed red. She slammed her clipboard down on the table. That's a lie, she barked. He's twisting facts, taking things out of context. You people don't understand what it takes to keep this place running. But the crowd was no longer with her. A man in the front row stood up. You charged me $300 for trimming my hedges an inch too short. Meanwhile, you've been cashing in on our dues? You've been stealing from us, Karen. A chorus of agreement rose, angry voices overlapping. Karen's defenses crumbled further with every word. Thomas Green sighed heavily. We've heard enough, he said, tapping his gavel. This board will now accept motions from residents regarding Mrs. Miller's future as president. A motion for her resignation, someone shouted from the back. Second, another voice rang out immediately. Karen's eyes widened. You can't do this to me. I am the HOA president. Karen's face burned crimson, her jaw trembling as though the weight of the vote itself had knocked the air out of her lungs. She sat frozen at the oak table, clutching the edge until her knuckles turned white. Just a few days ago, she had walked through the neighborhood with her clipboard held high, barking orders and handing out fines like a queen punishing her peasants. Now, in the span of one evening, she had been dethroned, stripped not by an outside authority, but by the very people she had once commanded. The irony was cruel, and Ethan savored it. The woman who had slapped him with a $1,000 fine for the crime of swimming in his own lake now found herself shackled with an extra $5,000 in annual dues. It wasn't just a financial hit. It was humiliation crafted with surgical precision. She had tried to make an example out of him, and instead, he had turned her into the neighborhood's cautionary tale. From his seat near the back, Ethan watched the storm play across her face. Rage, denial, disbelief, all the colors of a tyrant watching her castle burn. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The silence of his victory was enough. Every murmur of laughter in the crowd, every pointed glare directed at Karen, every whispered, serves her right, was a symphony of justice. Karen tried to speak, her voice cracking. This isn't fair. You people don't understand what you've done. But no one was listening. For years, she had weaponized rules, twisting them to her advantage. Now Ethan had taken that same weapon, sharpened it, and driven it straight into her empire. The board members looked away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Neighbors she once bullied into submission whispered openly, some smirking, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For the first time, Karen Miller wasn't the one dictating the rules. She was the one trapped by them. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. He didn't need to say a word. The revenge was already complete, executed not through anger or shouting, but through patience, calculation, and the very bylaws Karen had once used to keep others beneath her heel. She had thought she'd broken him with that $1,000 fine. Instead, she had unlocked the door to her own downfall, and Ethan Hayes had stepped through it without mercy. The morning after the vote, the neighborhood felt different. The air seemed lighter, conversations freer. For years, residents had lowered their voices when Karen Miller walked by, terrified of her clipboard and the penalties she wielded like a sword. But now, that same clipboard lay forgotten in her kitchen, its edges curled and coffee-stained. Karen, for the first time in a decade, had no authority to lean on. Still, she wasn't ready to surrender. Karen was not the type to accept defeat quietly. By sunrise, she was already on the phone with her lawyer, her words sharp, her tone panicked. "They can't do this to me," she snapped. "I'm the president of this HOA. They don't have the right to amend bylaws against me." Ethan Hayes manipulated them. He tricked the board. Her attorney sighed on the other end. "Mrs. Miller," the residents voted. The board ratified. Legally, the amendment stands unless you can prove fraud, and from what I've seen in the documents Mr. Hayes circulated, his evidence against you is compelling. Karen's eyes burned. Evidence? Lies. He took my work out of context. I've done nothing but protect this community. "Mrs. Miller," the lawyer interrupted gently, "if you pursue this in court, not only will you lose, but discovery will likely reveal even more about your financial dealings. I strongly advise against it." But Karen wasn't listening. Rage boiled in her veins, drowning out reason. The first attempt, appeals. She filed an appeal with the County Housing Committee, storming into their office with binders and frantic notes. But the officials reviewed the paperwork Ethan had meticulously submitted. The property deed, proving his lake was beyond HOA jurisdiction. The meeting minutes from the vote, the sign amendment. It was airtight. "Mrs. Miller," one clerk told her kindly but firmly, "you don't own the lake, and the HOA no longer has unilateral control." The residents voted. "There's nothing more we can do for you." Karen left the office trembling, her manicured nails biting into her palms. She was used to clerks bowing to her tone, to rules bending in her favor. This time the doors stayed shut. The second attempt, lawyers. Undeterred, she hired a new lawyer, an expensive one with a reputation for bulldozing opponents. They filed injunctions, demanded emergency hearings, and sent threatening letters to Ethan's mailbox. Ethan read each letter calmly, tucked them into a folder, and handed them straight to his attorney. He never wavered, never rose to Karen's bait. When Karen's lawyer argued that the amendment was punitive and vindictive, the judge raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Miller," the judge said during one hearing, "it seems you once fined Mr. Hayes $1,000 for swimming in his own lake." Karen stiffened, sweat prickling her neck. "That was within my authority as HOA president." The judge held up a hand. "But you had no jurisdiction over his private property. Your authority was misapplied." The board correcting that misuse is not vindictive, it is corrective. Case dismissed. The gavel's crack echoed in Karen's ears long after the courtroom emptied. The third attempt, threats. Humiliation curdled into fury. Karen began leaving notes in her neighbors' mailboxes, scribbled accusations against Ethan, warning that his lies would destroy the neighborhood. She cornered residents at the mailbox cluster, insisting she was the victim of a conspiracy. But instead of sympathy, she found resistance. "Karen, you fined my granddaughter for drawing with chalk on the sidewalk," one woman told her coldly. "You made me remove my American flag," another neighbor said. "I'm done listening to you. You stole our money, Karen," a man spat. "Now you're paying it back. Fair's fair." The whispers that once obeyed her now rejected her. Doors closed when she walked by. Conversations stopped when she approached. Children who once scattered in fear now laughed behind her back. Karen was alone, her kingdom reduced to ashes. Ethan's quiet triumph. Ethan, meanwhile, didn't gloat. He spent his evenings on the dock of his grandfather's lake, fishing pole in hand, the ripples of the water reflecting the fading sunlight. Neighbors sometimes joined him now, free to enjoy the lake without fear. Parents brought their children down to skip stones. Couples walked hand in hand along the path Karen once patrolled like a guard dog. He never boasted about his victory. He didn't need to. The peace around him spoke louder than any words. Yet he kept his guard up. He knew Karen well enough to understand she wasn't finished. Karen's spiral. Weeks stretched into months. Karen's $5,000 annual increase was invoiced with the rest of her dues. She refused to pay it first, declaring it illegal. But the HOA, now free of her grip, enforced it ruthlessly. Late fees stacked up. Letters piled in. Her pristine home, once the showcase of the neighborhood, began to show signs of wear. The lawn grew patchy. The shutters faded. She was too consumed with legal battles to care for appearances. And appearances had always been her pride. At night, she stared at stacks of bills, her savings dwindling. Every time she looked at the number, $5,000, her stomach turned. Ethan's face flashed in her mind, calm, steady, untouchable. She had fined him a single $1,000. He had returned fivefold, locked in a law, unshakable. And there was nothing she could do to undo it. Ethan's reflection. One evening, sitting on the dock, Ethan thought back to his grandfather. The old man had always warned him, power attracts the wrong kind of people. But the law, if you respect it, can protect you. Ethan smiled faintly, running his hand along the weathered wood of the dock. He hadn't just avenged himself, he had restored balance to the community. He had shown that bullies, no matter how powerful, could be brought down, not with fists, not with shouting, but with patience, proof, and precision. Karen had tried to drown him in bureaucracy. Instead, she was the one sinking. And Ethan had no intention of throwing her a lifeline. Closing scene. By the end of the season, the neighborhood had transformed. Kids laughed freely on bikes along the lake path. Families hosted barbecues without fear of citations. The HOA, once Karen's private army, was now managed by a fair-minded committee. Karen's house stood as the only shadow in the neighborhood, a pale reminder of a fallen tyrant. Curtains always drawn, mailbox overflowing, lawn unkempt. She had become a ghost haunting the very community she once ruled. And Ethan? He remained the quiet figure on the dock, the man who had defended his grandfather's legacy and reclaimed his freedom with a weapon Karen never expected. Her own rules turned against her. The revenge was complete. The aftermath was hers to endure. The neighborhood hadn't felt this alive in years. It began slowly, almost cautiously, as though the residents of Willow Creek had to remind themselves what freedom even looked like. For so long, Karen Miller's shadow had stretched across every path, every lawn, every conversation. Her clipboard had been more than paper and ink. It had been a weapon, silencing joy, crushing spontaneity. But once that shadow lifted, something remarkable happened. One Saturday morning, a father and son appeared at the lake's edge with fishing rods in hand. The boy was maybe 9, wide-eyed and nervous, casting glances over his shoulder as though expecting Karen to leap out of the trees with a fine slip in hand. When nothing happened, when no voice barked at them to stop, the father whispered, "Go ahead, son." The boy cast his line, and when the bobber plopped into the water, he smiled, a real, unguarded smile. A ripple spread across the lake, not just in water, but in spirit. By the following weekend, more families came. Mothers with picnic baskets, kids balancing on wobbly bicycles, couples strolling hand in hand along the dirt path Ethan had cleared with his grandfather decades ago. The sound of laughter began to return, tentative at first, then louder, freer. Ethan noticed it most in the evenings. He'd sit on the dock with a fishing rod, the setting sun casting gold across the ripples, and behind him he'd hear the echoes, children racing on their bikes, neighbors greeting each other without hushed tones, even bursts of music from backyard barbecues. The lake, once a silent witness to Karen's tyranny, had become a stage for joy again. Karen's absence. Her absence was noticeable, too. The house at the cul-de-sac that once gleamed with fresh paint and manicured shrubs now seemed hollow. The shutters sagged, the grass browned. Curtains stayed drawn. People passed by without pausing, without fear, almost as if the house itself was fading into irrelevance. For years, Karen had patrolled the sidewalks like a sheriff. Now she didn't show her face. No one missed her. Freedom wasn't just in the ability to fish or ride bikes. It was in the relief of no longer glancing over one's shoulder, no longer holding one's breath when opening a letter from the HOA, no longer dreading the sound of a knock at the door. The neighborhood had space to breathe again. Ethan's reflection. For Ethan, it was more than victory. It was vindication. He'd spent nights wondering if he'd made a mistake, if challenging Karen would only tighten her grip. But every laugh he heard now, every child daring to draw chalk on the sidewalk or skip stones across the lake, reminded him he'd made the right choice. Sitting on the dock one evening, he thought about his grandfather. The old man had loved this place not because it was perfect, but because it was free. The lake had been his sanctuary, a reminder that land was meant to be lived on, shared, and respected, not micromanaged into submission. Ethan whispered into the breeze, "I did it, Grandpa. Your lake is free again. A neighborhood reborn." Freedom rippled outward like waves from stone tossed in water. The HOA board, once cowed by Karen's iron grip, embraced transparency. Meetings became open forums where residents spoke freely. Dues were redirected toward real improvements, repairing the playground, repainting the community pool, planting new trees along the walking paths. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now worked side by side, repainting fences and patching roofs. What had been a collection of isolated, fearful households was becoming a community again. And Ethan's lake became the heart of it all. On summer evenings, families spread blankets on the shore, children racing barefoot into the shallows while parents laughed. On autumn mornings, joggers paused to watch the mist rise off the water. Even winter brought gatherings, residents skating on the frozen surface, sipping hot cocoa from thermoses. The lake, once claimed by one tyrant, now belonged to everyone in spirit, though the deed remained in Ethan's name. Karen's bitterness. But not everyone celebrated. Behind her drawn curtains, Karen seethed. Every laugh that echoed across the water, every gathering she glimpsed from her window, was a dagger. They weren't supposed to thrive without her. They weren't supposed to find joy in her absence. Sometimes she'd stand at her window, watching children ride the very bikes she once banned. She'd mutter, "Ungrateful. They'll see. They'll regret pushing me out." But her mutterings reached no ears. Her kingdom had been reclaimed, her voice drowned out by the sound of freedom. Ethan's quiet pride. Ethan never boasted. He never stood in the clubhouse to remind them who had toppled Karen. He never asked for praise. His revenge had never been about glory. It had been about peace. And now, watching the lake sparkle under the sun, hearing the chorus of life returning, he felt the deepest satisfaction a man could know. Not triumph, not gloating, just freedom. The freedom to swim without permission slips. The freedom for children to laugh without fear of fines. The freedom for neighbors to trust each other again. And perhaps most importantly, the freedom for Ethan to sit on his grandfather's dock, line in the water, heart at ease, knowing he had defended the legacy entrusted to him. Closing scene. On a crisp evening, as autumn leaves swirled across the water, Ethan cast his line and leaned back. Behind him, the neighborhood glowed with lights, laughter carrying faintly through the trees. He smiled, not because he had won against Karen, but because everyone had won. The lake was no longer a battleground. It was a symbol, a reminder that no bully, no matter how entrenched, could stand forever against truth and patience. For the first time in years, Willow Creek was free, and freedom echoed across the water. Ethan stood on the dock as dawn's light kissed the rippling surface of the lake. Mist hovered like a veil of secrecy, the same way it had for generations, hiding and revealing what it pleased. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a fragrance that reminded him of his grandfather, of long summers when the only rules that mattered were respect for the land and respect for each other. That morning ritual had become his new way of marking victory. Every day, at sunrise, Ethan swam. No stopwatch, no competition, no one telling him when or where. Just him and the water. The strokes were not for fitness alone, but for memory, for reclamation, for a vow that this lake would never again fall into the hands of petty tyrants with clipboards. Each time he broke the surface, he tasted freedom on his lips. Karen was gone now, her power stripped piece by piece, just as she had once stripped away joy from her neighbors. Her infamous clipboard, once the symbol of fear, now gathered dust in a forgotten corner of her garage. Ethan sometimes imagined it sitting there, the pen still clipped to the top, waiting to be lifted like a sword that would never again be wielded. It amused him, the thought of her empire crumbling not through violence, but through rules she herself had once enforced with a fanatic zeal. But Ethan's victory was more than personal. The neighborhood had changed. What once had been a collection of houses bound by resentment and fear was now a community. He saw it in the way children laughed freely, their bicycle wheels spinning down the cul-de-sac without Karen's shadow looming over them to demand safety fees. He heard it in the way fathers and mothers lingered at the lakeside, casting fishing lines not because they craved the catch, but because they craved peace. The laughter returned first. That was the sound he noticed most. For years, the lake had been quiet, as if it too had been shackled by Karen's rules. Families had avoided it out of spite or fear of fines. It had become a symbol of control, not joy. But now, the water sang again. Children splashed at its edge, their giggles carried by the breeze. Neighbors waved to each other, something they hadn't done in years. Friendships rekindled, feuds faded. Even the old man, Mr. Hargrove, who hadn't spoken to anyone in a decade, could be found sitting in a lawn chair by the water, feeding ducks and chatting with whoever passed by. The HOA, once a dreaded name, was reborn as something useful. Meetings became opportunities for neighbors to collaborate, not to impose fines. Ethan never sought to lead. It wasn't in his nature, but his influence was undeniable. People looked to him, not as a ruler, but as a reminder of what it meant to stand one's ground. His story was whispered like folklore. The man who beat the HOA at its own game. Kids even turned it into a sort of legend, daring each other to touch the dock he rebuilt, calling it the Dock of Freedom. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost of her former self. Rumors spread. Some said she tried to sell her house, others that she was too stubborn to leave. What was clear was that she no longer held sway. The sight of her once sent ripples of unease through the streets. Now, it barely raised an eyebrow. Without her title, without her fines, she was simply Karen, an aging woman with too much pride and not enough power. She had built her identity on control, and when it was taken from her, she became hollow. Ethan, however, did not revel in her downfall for long. His victory had been sweet, yes, but it wasn't revenge that sustained him. It was the restoration of balance. He remembered something his grandfather once told him while teaching him how to swim across the lake. The water doesn't belong to you, Ethan. You belong to it. Treat it well, and it'll always give back. Those words lingered in his mind as he looked over the clear surface, reflecting the sky like a mirror. It wasn't enough for Ethan to enjoy the lake. He wanted to ensure its legacy. So, he began quietly working on projects. He collaborated with local conservationists to protect the shoreline from erosion. He invited schools to bring children for field trips, teaching them about the ecosystem, the fish, the birds that nested in the reeds. He built picnic tables and fire pits for families to gather. Every improvement wasn't just for him. It was for the community, for the generations who would inherit what had nearly been destroyed by greed and bureaucracy. His neighbors noticed. They began volunteering. Some brought tools, others food for the workdays. The same families once fractured by fear of fines now stood shoulder to shoulder, building something together. They planted trees, painted benches, repaired fences. Slowly, the lake became more than a backdrop for houses. It became the beating heart of the neighborhood. Ethan never forgot, though, how close they had come to losing it. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit on the dock and think about Karen's reign. He thought about the letters, the fines, the endless stress she caused over the smallest infractions. A misplaced trash bin, a car parked an inch over the line, a child's laughter deemed too loud. It was astonishing how much damage one person could do with the illusion of authority. But it was also astonishing how quickly that illusion crumbled when challenged. One evening, while hosting a small gathering by the fire pit, a neighbor raised a toast. "To Ethan," she said, her glass catching the glow of the flames. "The man who gave us our freedom back." Ethan smiled but shook his head. "Not me," he replied. "All of us. I just reminded you that you could fight back." Still, he knew the truth. If he hadn't stood up, if he hadn't risked Karen's wrath, the lake might still be silent, the neighborhood still shackled. That knowledge gave him a sense of responsibility. His legacy wasn't just reclaiming his own rights. It was giving others the courage to reclaim theirs. As the seasons turned, the lake told the story better than he could. In summer, it was alive with swimmers, kayaks, and laughter. In autumn, it mirrored the fiery colors of the trees, reminding everyone of cycles: death, renewal, resilience. In winter, it froze over, becoming a playground for children who skated and slid, their cheeks flushed with joy. And in spring, it thawed, promising life anew. Ethan's story spread beyond the neighborhood. Articles were written about him. Local papers loved the underdog who defeated the HOA tyrant. Strangers sent letters, sharing their own battles with overreaching associations. Some called him a hero, others simply thanked him for showing it was possible to win. He never sought fame, but he accepted that his fight had become bigger than himself. And yet, when all was said and done, Ethan's greatest joy was still the simplest one. Each morning, he swam in his lake. The cold water wrapped around him, shocking him awake, reminding him he was alive. As he cut through the surface, he thought about legacy, not in terms of fame or headlines, but in terms of the laughter he heard from families, the peace etched on his neighbors' faces, the way the lake shone with life again. That was his legacy, not just a victory, not just a battle won, but the restoration of something timeless. The proof that one voice, when raised with conviction, could echo louder than the shrillest tyrant. And so, as the sun rose higher that morning, Ethan climbed out of the lake, water streaming from his shoulders, and stood tall on the dock. He looked out over the water, and smiled. It was his yesterday. It was his today. It would be his tomorrow. The lake was free. The people were free. And Ethan was finally free. Forever.